button. Okay, so this is the first episode of the Local Carbon Network group Q&A sessions. And we started a few minutes early, and Becky came on, and she immediately started with something very interesting. So we are going to start the recording right now. I mean, we have started the recording. And so you were saying you read this article on the New York Times?
Yes, and it was about putting together a compost in a box that you could have in your living room or inside your house. And we've been composting out in the backyard, but I thought, well, this could be interesting. So I wanted to try it. And it was from a person from Japan, and they do it there all the time. And they use cocoa peat or coir and hardwood ash, or no, kunten, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right.
Yeah, it's a bamboo char, I think, or I don't want to say something. It was something.
Well, she said in the article that you could use, you can't get that in the United States, but you could use a hardwood ash in place of it. So,
yeah. I would say charcoal more than ash, but definitely. You know, I read that very same article. So I'm actually in Italy. So we're doing this like, you know, kind of cross country. Hi, Rob. Pleased to meet you. So just quickly, while we're, you know, we're still kind of doing a little bit of housekeeping, I'm going to introduce you to Bob Flasher. He takes care of composting at Gill Tract Community Farm in California, Berkeley, California. And Rob, we have just met. I know about you. I don't. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Hello, good morning. My name is Rob Bennett, and I work with UC Cooperative Extension. Historically, I had two hats. One was as an administrator in the East Bay for Cooperative Extension, and the other, it's my sole hat, and that's 5-county urban agriculture advisor for Cooperative Extension. A lot of what I focus on is urban soil quality in that little window between low-level trace contaminants in urban soils where folks are growing food and the thresholds themselves, and focusing a lot on best practices. And
this is going to be a great episode.
That's enough. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning. Yeah, and Rob also helps us a lot at the Gill Tract Farm, just giving us advice about how to improve our soils and all sorts of other stuff.
Amazing. So Bob, yeah, why don't you just go ahead and tell us a little bit about your experience with composting at Gill Tract, and then we'll go back into the composting in the living room. And because this is about composting today, so you're actually like the very best people to be speaking to right now.
Yeah. So the Gill Tract Farm was started by people who I think read articles about what was going on in South America, about people taking unused land and farming it to provide for their livelihoods. And the university was not very interested in them doing that on university land. So one day they just cut the locks, went in, and planted thousands of crops that they had been raising in a greenhouse secretly. And when the university found out about it a couple of days later, they showed up in full force and told everyone that they were going to arrest them and their chickens if they didn't get off the land. And so people had to leave, and they bulldozed it. They bulldozed all the crops. And then people came back a week later with the rest of the crops they'd raised in the greenhouse and replanted. And so the university had been dealing with the local neighbors in Albany and West Berkeley who had been asking them for years if they could farm on the unused pieces of that land. And they kept saying, what part of no don't you understand? But then these people that came in to do these plantings were obviously way more unreasonable than the people who had been asking for the last 15 years. So the university cut a deal with them, and they said, okay, you can farm the land for 10 years. And then we have building plans. So we're about end of 8 years now, and we've been farming a long time. And I didn't realize that things had changed at the farm and with the university. And so I was driving home on one of the main roads that leaves the freeway, and it goes right by the farm. And I saw people gardening in there, a lot of people. And I said, oh, something must have changed. They aren't getting arrested. So I stopped in to see what was happening. And one woman, Catherine, one of the founders of the farm, took me around and toured me around and told me what was happening and said, you know what? We need someone to handle our composting operation because we're going to have to produce compost to keep our soils healthy. And I said, that's a great idea. Compost is really helpful. And she said, how would you like to do it? And I said, ooh, I don't know. I've never really done composting on any scale before. And so she said, I think you will learn. And so I got recruited and I've been doing it for, I don't know, 7 years now.
Okay, well, that's an amazing story, which I didn't know. So thank you. And Elizabeth has just joined us now. Elizabeth is a soil maven, and I like using that word. I'm still shy about using it, but I like using it.
I like it as well. I didn't know what it meant the first time I encountered it, and I've just taken to it.
Right.
It's an expert in whatever the field is.
Correct. And so you're a soil expert, and so Rob introduced himself right now. Do you know Rob? Do you know about Rob? Or do I need to introduce the two of you?
No, I don't know you. Nice to meet you. Please tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, he already.
Oh, I think we actually did meet at an Are you from Chico?
Oh, okay. I have attended events up there and biochar events up in Butte College.
Okay. So I'm the Urban Agriculture Advisor for Cooperative Extension for the Bay Area. A lot of what I focus on is urban soil quality, urban ag and food systems policy and food access and security, and edible landscaping.
So
Great.
like the three of you are like the perfect three people to be having a conversation because, we're all doing urban agriculture. We're all concerned about, the urban soil health, and you bring in that extra aspect of, the pollution in the soil and, what we can expect and how we can manage that. So seeing as this is a Q&A session and, maybe there'll be other people joining us, before we go off on a tangent, because I have about 1 million questions to ask all of you. But I would first like to ask Becky, because we kind of all know each other somehow, at least I know all of them already. So I just wanted to know, did you come onto the call with did you have any questions in mind? Did you want to know more about the cardboard box, or did you want to know, general composting? What's your questions?
I am honored to be here with all of you experts. And I am this baby novice right now. And so just thank you for having me here. Elizabeth invited me. I called SymSoil yesterday to order some more biochar, and we had the most wonderful conversation. And my mind has been going since then. She invited me to be on this call and, talked about how you're looking to have more, I see now, machines and production of biochar more around the United States. More carbon sequestering. The language is like all super new to me, but my dad, who is 93 years old, is an avid gardener, and I was raised with that. And so I'm so happy to be here. Questions? I had a question about my compost in a box, whether I was doing it right or not. And Elizabeth invited me to come on. So I just thank you, Elizabeth, and I appreciate your patience.
We invited, Aurora and I invited two people, Becky out of Texas and Jeanette out of Washington State, with the idea that as we start thinking about ambassadors, these are people who can help us find local people who are interested in create hubs.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just explain a little bit. We mustn't feel shy about, I don't know the right terminology or whatnot, because that's not the important part. The important part is, as we were saying, I think yesterday, talking dirty, you know, like just getting in there, doing our thing. So we're going to try and do a little bit about domestic. Hey, Aurora.
Morning.
Morning. So we're going to do a little bit about like home composting in just like a home and garden setting. Aurora, I'm going to mute you, but unmute yourself if you want to say something, okay?
Say that again.
I'm going to
okay. I got you.
Sorry, I said mute. Sorry. So the home composting, of course, the biochar is an incredible thing because what happens is, you know, CO2 is absorbed during the, you know, process of photosynthesis, and then we have plants that are carbon rich, and then that's when, you know, the plants, you know, they come to the end of their natural life cycle for one reason or another, they will either decompose and, you know, go back up as a greenhouse gas, you know, methanes and what, or they will burn and then, you know, produce, you know, go back up as CO2. So the whole idea around charcoal and biochar is it's a way of working with the plants, because, you know, the plants do all the capture work, and then all we need to do is not send it back up and just like sequester it. So that is the whole, you know, climate impact aspect in, like, you know, just absolute simple layman terms. I work, you know, in Italy, I work with kids as well, and, you know, everyone gets it. You know, we don't want to send it back up. And then we, you know, with all the research that we've been doing recently, you know, we're discovering that it does incredible things in the compost and then afterwards in the soil. So I'm not the best person, like, I know this stuff, but I saw Peter Hurst come on, so I'm going to actually invite him to speak in just a few minutes. I'm going to first speak a little bit about the ambassadors and the whole project and, you know, kind of the big idea with the local carbon network, because whoever's coming on as a person just interested in you know, in starting to compost and you know, doing the thing, we are trying to activate people that can work in their own communities. So we call them LCN ambassadors, and they're kind of like the doctor, you know, like the GP of composting in their own area kind of thing. Okay, so they will start off by learning how to compost for themselves. Chances are they're going to be completely enamored with the process, because that horrible, nasty thing that you have to take care of is suddenly actually a very interesting and wonderful process. And then start speaking to the people in your neighborhood, and, you know, become a little bit of also distribution hub, because the thing that we don't want is to be sending, you know, single little boxes of biochar here, there, and everywhere, because it's a different logic to what we want to do. And ultimately, over time, we're going to hopefully have, you know, biochar making machines, you know, in the various neighborhoods, in the various communities, but we have to start somewhere. And so, you know, we're willing, for example, now to start working with our ambassadors, you know, across the US, and, you know, sending them quite a large amount, and then they can kind of distribute it within their own community. But it's not, you know, it's not just giving the biochar, it's giving the biochar and just that advice and that, you know, that careful listening to people, because so many people are starting now with the home gardening, you know, in the garden or on the balcony. And we need to be able to support them, you know. So how much CO2 goes in? I'm sorry, I'm just reading here because a lot of people are signing up. So hi to everyone. We can't really introduce ourselves individually anymore because there's a whole bunch of us. So thank you for coming onto this call. I'm so excited about it. And I would suggest that if you have any questions, please go ahead and type it into the text, the chat box on the side. So I hope you are familiar with the Zoom. If you just look at the bottom panel, there's a little chat, and you click on the chat and it opens a pane on the side, and then you can just type in your question. And so I'm going to try and shut up so I can keep an eye on the questions as well that are showing up. Please type your questions in here. And I think I'm going to ask Bob to just speak about 5 minutes about how not difficult composting is, because when we start learning about composting and we go on the internet and it's like, it seems like you have to get it exactly right, and like you have to measure out, and it seems very complicated. And I think Bob is going to tell us that it's not. And then while he's speaking, I would say just please go ahead and type in your questions, and then I will read them out. And then I will probably ask various people. Now, in our midst, there's about 5-6 people that are kind of the guest speakers. And so I'm going to try and call you out, according to what I know of you and your experience, maybe you're the best suited to answer a specific question. So over to you. I like saying that. Over to you, Bob. And why don't you tell us, about composting and your experience and how to just take it easy, basically, and how things, go.
Well, the good news for us is that in 1 square inch of healthy soil, there's over 4 billion organisms, including bacteria, algae, fungus, protozoa, nematodes, mites, springtails, rotifers, tardigrades, and myriapods. And they all work 24/7 to convert dead matter into life-giving topsoil. So that gives us off to a big head start, because volunteers at the farm only spend about 3 or 4 hours there in a day. And all the things in the compost pile are working all the time. And it's like Becky was describing, learning about biochar and home composting and all that. She says, whoa, it's exploding. And that's exactly what biochar does to all the organisms living in compost piles. It helps them communicate way better with each other and absorb nutrients way better. And when you put it in the topsoil on your farm or in your garden, it does the same thing. It just really facilitates nutrients moving into plants. And so when we started composting, we talked to people at other farms that had been doing it for a while. And they suggested either use bins or piles. And the bins, we just use the crates. We attach crates together and make a big square and then pile in the compost. And then every week we would take it and move it over to the crate next to it. And then the week after that, we would move it back to the original crate. And that was hard because you're having to lift over the walls to move it. And so then we did movable walls in between. And that wasn't working so good either, because the compost on one side would be really heavy and it would start pushing the wall over like this. So we tried piles instead, which we had seen used at another farm. We just piled up browns and greens together and covered them with the tarp. And the reason for the tarp was that the turkey and the deer would spread the piles all over if we didn't. And also help keep in the moisture. But in order to get enough oxygen in the piles, we punched a whole bunch of holes in the top of the tarp everywhere. And that let oxygen through as well, because the oxygen makes the bacteria happy and the moisture keeps the fungus happy. So the piles have worked really good. And to hold the tarp down, we realized the things were burrowing underneath them. We have squirrels in the area that were dodging under the tarps and getting into the compost. So it became more of a management problem. So we built these gigantic squares. They were about 6 feet on a side, just made with 2x4s. And we laid them right over the top of the tarp like this to hold down the edges. So that holds the tarps in place in the windstorms and against creatures and things. And then what we do is once or twice a week, we just turn all the piles over. And if we don't have time to turn over the piles to aerate them, we just stick the pitchfork in the side of the pile and wiggle the pitchfork back and forth like this from all the different sides. And that gets a lot of air in it and helps the bacteria out immensely. So you can be as lazy as you want. I mean, one of the most popular ways to do compost is make a pile. Just throw a whole bunch of browns and greens on a pile and let them sit there for 3 or 4 months and pray, or water them regularly and pray. And that usually gets results. But we needed to produce compost faster than that. And so our turnover time is about 6 or 7 weeks, especially if we turn it twice a week to re-aerate it. And let's see, I never tried composting in a box because we always, in fact, we tried we experimented with the double compost bins that All Power Labs was supplying. And it produces compost really well. You just turn over the bins regularly. You fill up one side first, and then after that gets going, then you fill up the other side of the bin, and they're insulated. So it really helps keep the compost warm, even though the pile isn't big. And that worked pretty good, but it wasn't enough for the farm. We just needed to do a lot more. So that's why we have piles. And when we're going good, we have about 10 different compost piles that are all about 3 feet tall and about 5 feet wide. And that keeps us in gear. And during the winter, we get a lot more piles going because we're not composting the land. We're not amending the soil so much. So we have a lot ready to go in the spring and summer. And now we've been putting it on the farm so fast that we only have about 4 or 5 compost piles left. So it's not hard. You just have to be willing to use a pitchfork a bit. And it's character building.
Yeah, and so, okay, so I think it's an important distinction. Some people who are listening to us will have a garden, and then that's kind of the big under a top, or, you know, with the pallets and make a big box. It has to be at least 3 feet square, you know, in all directions, to be able to have that heat that will allow the composting to happen in a non-insulated environment. Then what Bob was saying about the compost tumbler that they got from us, from All Power Labs and the local carbon network, that is the Joraform compost tumbler, and we actually sell it at cost on the website in a subscription model together with the biochar. So people who need to do it like on a smaller scale and would like to get that composter, you know, go to the website localcarbon.net, and you know, you can go have a look at that one. Then for example, we can't get them in Italy. We really struggled in the beginning, and we built our own tumblers. And then I wanted to try something even cheaper and simpler. So I actually use a styrofoam box, the ones that are used in the catering business. You know, the big ones for the food delivery. So what I'll do is I'm going to post, I'm looking at these things with Elizabeth as well. So we're going to find some boxes that can be purchased in the US. We'll put the links in the local carbon network group. So on Facebook, there are 2. There's the local carbon network, and then there's the local carbon network group, which is a private group. And it's really just kind of this self-help, you know, teaching each other and whatnot. And so this video is going to go there, and also any links, and I'll try and maybe type up, you know, a few of the main concepts that we spoke about in each, you know, Q&A session. My experience, so, I mean, basically what Bob is saying is, equal parts of browns and greens, the greens being your kitchen scraps or your green stuff, or like leaves, or coffee grounds, which are not green but are green, and your browns are scrap paper, not glossy, possibly not flashy, colorful ink, but, you know, just paper bag paper, or, you know, toilet rolls. Or we have a person in Texas actually that's works with APL. He takes the paper bags from the shopping, and he puts them through one of those machines, you know, the ones that shred the documents.
Ooh.
Yeah, and so just he runs it through that. So equal parts of that, and I would say 10 to 20% of biochar. in the mix. We usually wet the biochar before. A 10% is it already gets the pile nice and hot. We were speaking with Peter Hurst. We have two biochar experts. We have Austin Liu with us, and we have Peter Hurst. So I'll try and get them to say a few words on biochar specifically just now. But let's say that the compost activation, you have it with a 10%, but then with up to a 20% or even 30%, then you have a better water holding capacity as well. And regarding the box, you know, I read that article. I have a Japanese friend. I sent her the Japanese instructions, and she's actually starting it, I think, next week. I got her some biochar. And so we are going to be experimenting, because I never tried that specific method in the cardboard box, not insulated, and also indoors. So I saw that the amount of charcoal in there is quite high. Elizabeth, you wrote a kind of a reaction article to that. So I think you have a bit more.
I was going to suggest that as you get pictures, as you get comments from your friend, let's post that on Medium, because that particular article has had close to 400 people read it. And there's a lot of interest in the public in general in using biochar in composting.
Okay, definitely. You know, let me just have a look. I want to start giving over these questions, because there's about 5 questions already. Let's see, we have about 40 minutes. I would say let's try give 3 to 4 minutes for each answer right now, and then we can always circle back. And also, again, in the local carbon network group, today we're kicking off, and then we can keep the discussion going over the week. So things that require a simple answer, we'll answer it directly. Things that require a bigger answer, we'll discuss it, you know, the following week in the Q&A session. Okay, so okay, so I'm going to give this question to Austin Liu, which is our resident biochar expert, and it says, how much CO2 goes into air in the process of making biochar? Okay, so how much CO2 goes into the air in the process of making biochar? Austin, you have about 3 minutes. Open your mic and off you go.
Okay, so the question is how much CO2 goes into the air making biochar. There are various different processes for making it, so I'll have to speak about this in general. If you have a piece of wood, about 80% of the mass of presuming the wood is completely dry, so there's no moisture weight, 80% of the weight is volatile, and about half of that is carbon. And then the rest of that is oxygen and hydrogen. And then, so a piece of wood, 80% of it is volatile, 20% of it is fixed carbon. Now, what fixed carbon means is when you take that piece of wood and you heat it, all the stuff that can come off with the heat that comes off as smoke, that's the portion that is usually burned during the production of biochar. So the sort of overall rough estimate across all woody type materials is about half of the carbon comes off when you make the char and half of it remains. And it varies depending on, it varies depending on the type of wood and the type of material you're charring. Roughly half of the carbon is reverted back to gases and half of it remains. And now the cool thing about the part that remains is once you've made charcoal, the charcoal doesn't really revert back to the carbon dioxide without combustion. Charcoal is very resistant to decomposition because the microbes don't have the enzymes that are able to digest charred material, right? So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think it's important to add to that, Austin, the fact that the carbon goes in, but it's carbon neutral in the start, because being wood, it's taking CO2 out of the air, and it's not like a fossil fuel that's just adding.
Yeah. So to elaborate a little bit more on that, it matters where the carbon is coming from, right? Because with plants, all the carbon came from the atmosphere. One way to think about what you're doing when you're making biochar is if you're making solid black carbon and you're burying it in the ground, you're doing reverse coal mining. right? You're taking a plant material that's captured the carbon and you're putting a portion of it back in the ground and taking it out of the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is, basically decomposition and captured by plants. Now, the percentage I told you about like half the carbon reverts to the atmosphere, that is if you are doing nothing but making the char. If you are doing, for example, gasification, in the case of All Power Labs, our reactor is making a gas, and the gas making process consumes some of the char to make the gas. So the gasification process yields about 5% biochar from the feedstock by dry weight. If you are now, the benefit of that is it's producing a gas by which you're generating electricity, which is renewable energy, and it's doing it on an on-demand basis. So you're using the wood sort of like a chemical battery for solar energy. If all you are doing is generating char, there are more and less useful ways of doing that. So, for example, if you're using something that is one of those biochar stoves, a so-called T-LUD, top lit updraft stove, you can use that heat and cook your food. If you are doing nothing but making biochar and just letting that heat dissipate, you may be capturing more carbon, but you're also wasting all the energy. So when you talk about the carbon footprint of making biochar, you should also consider all of the other things that you may or may not be displacing. If you are only making biochar, the carbon footprint is a little bit higher because you're not displacing anything. If you're making biochar while cooking your food, that's natural gas you're not using. If you're making biochar, but you're generating electricity and it's in an area where your electricity would otherwise be coming from coal or natural gas, that electricity is also offsetting something that would have a higher carbon footprint. So it's a little bit more complicated once you look at all the other things it's attached to.
Thank you, Austin. So to interpret in very, very simple terms, I would say, okay, so 1 kilogram, when we're producing electricity and heat and using that, 1 kilogram of biochar has a CO2 impact of 20 kilograms of greenhouse gas, of CO2 and equivalents. So 1 kilogram biochar, 20 kilograms of CO2 impact, which means carbon sequestered into the ground and greenhouse gases that have been offset. Is that correct, Austin?
There's a little bit of subtlety that should be pointed out. When carbon burns into carbon dioxide, you're adding 2 oxygens to 1 carbon, and the oxygen is actually way more than the carbon. So 1 kilogram of carbon can produce 3 point something. I think it's like 3.7. Yeah, 3 point some odd kilograms of CO2. So there's actually a weight increase. So if you look at wood is a carbohydrate, right? There's a lot of oxygen and hydrogen in there, and so like the mass of stuff coming off of the wood, only about half of the volatiles is carbon. The rest of it is oxygen. So when we factor for like what's coming off the wood, that's another consideration. Am I addressing your question properly, or am I sort of missing?
Yeah, I'm just giving a kind of a ballpark figure. So I mean, just to say for people who, because sometimes I love to hear you speak, but then it's like, okay, wait. So, but just to give a simple, like really ballpark, CO2 impact 1 kilogram of biochar, we can safely say with all the outliers that it's about 20 kilograms of CO2. Okay,
so I want to back that up a little bit. Are you talking about strictly about All Power Labs systems, or just ballpark?
If you're using the electricity and the heat.
Could I jump in? Because in a prior discussion, Austin said something that really enlightened my thinking, which was to think about it in terms of colors. Once you're using this compost with the biochar, you've got the black carbon that's gone into the soil from the biochar. You've got the green carbon that's the plant roots that are sequestering carbon as they're growing the roots and leaving that in the ground. You've got white carbon from the fungal growth, which also is pulling carbon and adding it to the ground and to the soil. And then you've got all these microbes that are growing as well as the organic material. Think of that as brown carbon. So that's, I believe, where
that is
Austin came down with this idea that there's some biochar, but you're getting this enormous carbon sequestration. And Sylvia, I just sent you a picture if you care to share that with people that talks about the how this works.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
but I think is the question at hand about just the biochar production, because the certainly biochar has all these downstream carbon multipliers. It's like getting interest on the deposit. It's like
yeah, no, we're not
yeah.
going to go there yet.
Okay.
we're not going to put our people to sleep quite yet. I saw Peter's like doing this. Peter, would you like to add something?
Yes, first, the ratio you were looking for earlier is 3.6. For every unit of black carbon that goes in the ground, the CO2 equivalent is 3.6 times that, and that's based on the molecular weight of carbon and oxygen. I would like to add one thing to the upstream end, the production end, on carbon savings, carbon sequestration, and that is that you also have to consider the source of the biomass that you are using. Because of the downstream effects of existing biomass, there are wood sources that you do want to use to make biochar, and there's others that you want to leave alone. You're not going to cut down a tropical rainforest to produce feedstock to make your biochar, because that tropical rainforest is doing more good with respect to the entire ecosystem in place. On the other hand, if you have a stream of wood chips that is headed toward a landfill someplace or worse, that you use for biochar, because that does save carbon from going back into the atmosphere. This gets into the controversy about growing purpose-grown crops to make biochar. But the simplification of it is, if your feedstock source is more like a living rainforest, you want to leave it alone. If it's more like waste wood on the way to the landfill, that's fair game for feedstock. Beetle kill pine in California, for instance, that's all headed right back to the atmosphere. Any of that you can haul out of the woods and make biochar is very productive and a tremendous carbon savings.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I'm going to keep you actually answering questions because just to answer Becky quickly, one of my initial questions was just how much biochar and woody material to put in a compost box. I kind of answered that before, so I would, in an insulated compost box, not the cardboard method, which we haven't tested yet, but the insulated compost, I would put a 10%, and then we're going to give all sorts of instructions going forward, and we're available, also on the local carbon group. So just type in there, and as you go, and we'll just try and keep you. And I wanted to actually ask you, Peter, and a little bit Elizabeth, because it's between soil, and also Rob could probably answer this. So you guys just feel free to jump in. How do we know that biochar facilitates more activity in soil biology? Peter, would you like to start, or Elizabeth?
Well, there are a couple of hundred papers that we could refer the
in a nutshell, Peter.
between reading Johannes Lehmann's 350-page text and simply doing your home experiments, our experience is that adding biochar to the composting process in particular, but also adding finished compost to the soil, put it under the microscope, and you have huge boosts in what at SymSoil we test with microscopy. We get down there at 400 to 1200 magnification, and we look at the little bugs, and there are definitely more happier bugs with the biochar than without.
Can you post a picture onto the group? Do you have a kind of two different? you know, even over the following days or weeks or whatnot. That would be amazing to see. Like, are you able to take a picture of the microscope?
Yes, I'm going to go out on, or I'm going to put Elizabeth out on a limb here and say, yes, we are, because we probably have that microphotography on file someplace. I see Elizabeth still smiling, so I would say yes.
Let me find some good pictures for you, because I have hundreds and I'll select one. Select several.
Okay. So
we also have some macro evidence. We have pictures of some cultures that Katie has done on the 1 yard scale, where she would add, for instance, an oyster mushroom inoculation to a bin of biochar, and it just took off, completely myceliated within a day or two. Things like that.
Beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the next question. Please forgive me if I kind of misread or mispronounce. I'm terrible, but Robani, the question is there a methodology you could recommend for biochar users that they could use to collect data on the water-saving qualities and increased vegetable productivity of biochar in the garden? So I would say, again, this is, I would say, more for Peter and Austin as well.
Yes, the easiest way to do that, of course, is to meter your water inputs on bed A versus bed B, or field A versus bed B. Not everybody has access to an accurate water flow meter, but flow of water is a function of time. So if you can simply, if you're using the same hose or the same drip irrigation configuration between bed A and bed B, you can simply time how much water is on each, keep track of that. If you want to get a little more sophisticated, put a moisture meter in each one, and you don't need a calibrated moisture meter. There are some sort of binary moisture meters where there's a red zone and a green zone, or a yellow zone and a green zone on the meter, and you can do your moisture measurements by hand. Whatever feels good to your hand is the right amount of water in there, and just time how long the water is on for each watering session. It does take some measurement. For production, the easiest way to do that is photographically. Just photograph the 2 beds every day for a couple of months, or whatever the growing season is up to harvest. Just do it visually. An incredible amount of farming is done simply by looking, right? What's the best fertilizer for the garden? It's the gardener's shadow, right? So the more time you spend out there, and just record photographically what your eye is seeing. You can take samples, you can do root biomass, you can do surface biomass, you can do all plant biomass. If you want to get into actual drying and measuring of all that, you can do that too. But there are simple ways anybody can do it, just photographically. But there's a third measurement I'm going to recommend, because it's not all about immediate productivity. Benefits of biochar in temperate regions, that in soil that's already been taken very good care of, the benefits are mostly underground. There's only a certain amount of productivity you can get out of soil, because you have the limiting factors of sunlight and water. But what biochar in good soil, in temperate climates particularly, over time does, is to build the wealth of the soil. It'll build the depth of the topsoil, which is easy to measure. It will build the chemical and biological richness and robustness of the soil over time, which is not as easy to measure, but it can still be done. So in looking for results, I would urge people to look at water savings for sure, productivity, yield increases for sure, but even spend more time on what's the quality of that soil being built. And you can do that directly, both chemically and biologically, because that's where the wealth is. Water savings and productivity measures current inputs and income, but the quality of the soil is long-term wealth.
Fantastic. That's a great answer. Austin, go ahead. So I just want to let you know what I'm seeing. I cannot see Bonnie on my screen. I can see Peter, Austin, Elizabeth, and Rob and Bob. So, oh, great. Now you have a camera on, so I can see you as well. And in case you want to pitch in, you know, like our guest speakers, I love calling guest speakers. If you want to pitch in something, I can see you, so you can actually show me, and then I'll come point to you and I'll ask you. We have 9 questions that are now in the list. Austin, very briefly, go ahead, add your comment.
Okay, so if you want to gauge the impact of the ability or the impact of the biochar addition to the soil, if you have a couple of 2-liter bottles, you can actually do a quick experiment. Poke some holes at the bottom of one bottle, you know, cut it in half and nest it inside another, and load a sample of soil in there, and have a fixed measure of water, like 1 cup of water, or maybe like a pint of water or whatever, and basically pour 1 into each. You can see, you know, you want to maybe reserve your soil sample from before and then sample 1 later, but you want to do it side by side so you can see the difference, or maybe even just use a smartphone and record the difference. But you can see how much water runs through. If you have a soil that doesn't hold water well, what will happen is either a lot of water will run through, and the soil won't retain much of it, or it will run off because the soil is not permeable, and then the liquid runs off. And a soil that is really good at retaining water is typically good at percolating water as well. What you'll find is you'll pour water in, very little will run off, but very little will, you know, some of it will run through, but the soil will hold a lot of it like a sponge. And that's a quick visual way, a very low-tech way. There's no, you know, it doesn't even have to be technical. You could just see, wow, this soil holds water like a sponge. This one, all of it ran through or ran off, right? And I'll post a link to the group chat for a demonstration for how you can see some quick tests you can do on the soil to see what the additions have done to it.
Yeah, look, thank you for that. Also, because we have, again, 2 solutions. We have kind of the gardening solution where you know, you can time the hose running, and that's like if you can't actually, you know, and if you want to test the sample, now we have this other methodology. So that's great.
One other quick thing to do is if you have if you want to see the impact on the growth of plants, if you don't mind sacrificing a small seedling, what happens is one quick way you could see how much it's stimulated root development is just pull a little plant out and shake off the roots. And presuming that you do them under the same conditions, when you pull one out and look at it like after you know, a certain amount of time of growth, you'll see a certain amount of root mass. And you know, in a case where you have very vigorous root mass, sometimes you have trouble pulling it out, or you pull it out and it pulls off a really large root ball. And just visually, you could just get an intuitive sense. Okay, this one had this much root growth, and this one with biochar had this much root growth. So that's the other way.
Okay, thank you. A question for Bob from Bonnie. What material are you using for the tops?
Whatever we can scavenge, pretty much. Once people found out about our farm, they started calling us up because they had extras they wanted to get rid of. There's an organic vegan cafe right down the block that had a whole bunch of greens that they were having to pay extra to have hauled off. And so we just pick those up every week for them and add those to our compost. There's a local horse operation which they feed their horses really healthy food, and they bring us loads of composted manure regularly, but they cover them with big tarps, big kind of plasticky tarps. And a lot of times the tarps have holes in them from rats gnawing their way into their hay bales during the winter. And so they give those to us. And so we just use those to cover our piles. So I don't think it matters that much what kind of fabric you use to cover the piles. One of our piles is covered just in black plastic because, I don't know, we ended up with a roll of that for some reason. And we just punched a lot of holes in it so it will breathe better. So it doesn't seem to make a difference too much what the material is.
Amazing, thank you. So Robani, I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing this. Robani, writes, it's not a question.
It's Robini. Don't worry about Robini.
Thank you. I felt terrible. Robini.
No.
Robini. Okay. So, Robini, we use a Jubin that works really well, great aeration and easy to use. Robini, why don't open your mic and just tell us a little bit about that, and then maybe you can post a picture or something in the group afterwards.
I'm part of the Master Gardeners in Contra Costa County, and so we compost at our demonstration garden in Walnut Creek, and that's there that we use the geobins, and we have there's different sizes. We use the 4-foot wide, and they're so easy to use. They're like a long sheet with lots of holes in it, and you wrap it in a circle, and they've got these little connectors that are very easy to use that you just put in to anchor it. So literally you can create it, fill it up, alternating the greens and the browns in the water, a little bit of manure. I'm going to talk them into putting it in biochar the next time is what I'm hoping to do, and maybe set up two test beds. That's why I'm asking about the methodology. And that they get 160 degrees after a day or two, and it stays that way for a week. I mean, I'm not the expert in making compost there, but Joey Spinelli is, and so I really feel grateful to work with him. And they make a lot of compost. It's impressive. It's beautiful stuff. But I'm imagining it would even be better with biochar.
Yeah, we're confident that now it is at this point. Okay, so yeah, please post something to the group. Again,
okay, I'll do that.
Yeah, we try and really get, you know, from the DIY to all the various solutions, you know, just what the various things can work in various scenarios. So we, you know, and according to people's also individual needs and preferences and whatnot. So let's try and get that in there. Let me see. So thank you, Elizabeth, for the picture. I'm a little bit app spastic in the sense that, like, I'm not the best person with technology. So I think I'm going to post this to the Facebook group so I don't end up blowing up Zoom or doing something terrible. Okay, forgive me.
The other option would be to let me control the share my screen for a moment or two.
Can you share your screen? Because I'm not sure how to give you those controls right now.
Okay, just a thought.
We'll do a test run. I'll get better, I promise.
She can actually share her screen just at the very bottom. If she takes her mouse and scans the bottom of her screen, even as a participant, she can share her screen.
Okay.
You don't have to give. Yeah.
Try that a second, Elizabeth. Let's do this incredibly dangerous thing.
Okay, Sylvia, I think first you need to go to the bottom, and there's an icon of a mouse.
Multiple participants can share simultaneously.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I've done that. Drum roll. Yay!
So can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is sort of, SymSoil is a soil health company focused on the soil biology. But after listening to Austin and the way he talked about biochar and colors, this helped me see it much more easily. I'm going to shrink this a tad because I'm not sure that you can see the whole thing. But basically, what I learned from Austin was think about the biochar as the black carbon, and the roots being the green carbon, and the fungal component being the white carbon, and then the rest of the organic matter and the microbes as brown carbon. And what we have found, I'm going to change pictures for a second. when Bob was talking about all the different entities that live in the soil, he was talking about the soil food web, which is the way that historically people have thought about this biology. And the biochar, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around, but the biochar historically has been thought of as almost like a coral reef, where there's little pockets of air and water that allow all of these creatures homes. And it makes it much easier for them to survive and do what they want. Now, Austin will tell you that there's stuff happening at the level of the electrons and so on, but for us, this is the essence of what matters. And your composting is a way of creating a home for all of these creatures and expanding the number of them, and they in turn do the nutrient cycling that feeds the plants the way nature intended.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So just give me a second, because I want to see if we have questions from, there's something from Austin. Okay, so that's fine. So I'm seeing that we're actually really, you know, kind of writing to each other, so I can relax. We have 15 minutes, and what we managed to cover, great, because it'll be in the video for the benefit of people who want to look at this later. And what we don't cover, we will cover next week. So, Austin, to everyone, would you like to read your comment? The summary: 1 kilogram biochar roughly yields 3.6. Okay. So read that comment, and then I saw Peter raise his hand, and then Aurora.
So
Elizabeth,
the comment that I posted is a summary of how you would go about reckoning how much carbon dioxide is produced from your feedstock. If you are making just the char and you're not doing any of the elaborated processes, about half of the carbon remains and half of the carbon is consumed, right? And for the biochar, we're rounding it up to 100% carbon. It's closer to like 80-90% carbon, but if you round it off, the half of the carbon remains, half the carbon goes up into the air, and the part of the carbon that goes into the air as carbon dioxide, the weight increases because you're burning it. And so the conversion is the little math I put in there. 1 kilogram of biochar roughly yields 3.6, maybe 4 kilograms of carbon dioxide during production, and for the reasons I mentioned. I do have a couple of minor corrections I want to add in. These are minor, subtle, but they're important. Elizabeth, you'd mentioned the carbon, the sort of colors, the black carbon, the green carbon, all that. The green carbon, in the reckoning of how much carbon is going where, the green carbon is not the plant roots. The green carbon is the plant root exudates. And this is because over the lifetime of a plant, about 70% to 75% of the carbohydrates made by the plants are sent into the ground. The carbohydrates that come off of the fruit and in the material of the plant, that's the minority fraction. The bulk of it actually gets sweat into the soil. So the green carbon is the plant root exudates, not the plant roots. The other comment that I posted down further down, I posted a couple of links. On YouTube, there's all sorts of interesting little DIY little demos you can do to see how much water is running off of your soil versus running through it. So those are the 2 links there. And I also commented the really ideal way is to combine the 2. I'm having a little bit of trouble finding the video where I saw them combined, but if you combine them, you can do these all with old soda bottles and stuff, right? Basically, you pour water on top and you see how much of it runs off and how much of it runs through, and that gives you a really visual, non-technical but very visual representation of how much water is being held in your soil after different types of amendments.
Okay, thank you. So Austin, please, if you don't mind, put the links on the Facebook group as well, because I may not be able to copy these across. Elizabeth, I want to see the pictures that you want to show us, but before I go there, I want to answer Aurora's question. So do we add biochar to compost bin, or rather add it in with bioactive compost after composting is complete and cooled? And I think I would like both Austin and Peter to explain why it's a better idea to add it in at the beginning of the composting process. So very briefly, I would say let's start with Peter, because Austin just spoke.
Excuse me. Thank you. Yes, I think it's important to do both. And we express that at SymSoil in 3 products. We have a product that is 10% biochar, 90% compost. We have a product that's 50-50, and then we have a product that is 90% compost with 10% biochar. Did I get that right? We have one that's 90% compost, one that's 90% biochar. So it depends on whether you're thinking of what you're putting in your soil as a compost delivery system that's enhanced by a little biochar, or a biochar delivery system that is boosted by good compost biology, or a balance of both. So it's always best to boost the composting process actually right from the beginning of the cycle, including growing the food that you're using the scraps for your biochar, growing the trees that you are making harvesting surplus to make your biochar, and feeding the animals that are making your manure with a little biochar. So we use it at the front end of the cycle and at the back end of the cycle. They're equally important.
Yeah, thank you.
Does that cover it?
Yeah, I think it covers it. Do we add biochar to compost bin, or rather add it in with? And you said both. You know, at APL, you know, we're very focused on adding it at the beginning of the composting process. I'm very excited to be you know, using the SymSoil finisher now, and you know, all that other good stuff. So thank you for that answer. Austin?
So the question is when biochar should be added. For the home composter, if you're talking about the APL type biochar, we recommend adding it at the beginning. Now this may be somewhat of a difference of opinion with Peter, but I don't advocate adding the raw biochar afterwards, because the raw char that is produced from a gasification
he's shaking
process.
His head. He's saying not raw biochar. He's saying actually.
No. Never raw biochar to the soil. And I think Aurora's question was premised on bioactive compost and prepared biochar after the process. Yeah, it's always always prepared before it goes in.
Yes. Okay.
Root contact.
Okay. I want to make sure about that. So Sylvia, could you repeat the question? I think I may have missed the way the question was phrased.
So do we add biochar to compost bin, or rather add it in with bioactive compost after composting is complete and cooled?
The benefits are disproportionately towards adding it toward the beginning. When you add the biochar to the compost before, the effect that you get is the biochar benefits the compost, and the compost benefits the biochar. So I'm going to explain how the compost benefits the biochar first. Earlier I just mentioned that the biochar is a pretty aggressive adsorptive medium, right? Which is why you shouldn't just add it to the soil. It'll suck things up and absorb them. And when you add that to the compost, the decomposition products end up coating and sticking to the char and make the char ready for addition to the soil. It dresses the char in like a coat of decomposition products, and that actually seems to be what carries out the water retention and the nutrient exchange. Now, how the biochar benefits the compost is that the carbon absorbs odors, right? And if you don't add the biochar before, you lose that benefit. One of the things that we observed at Giltrack Farm, Bob can also attest to this. Prior to the addition of biochar, back in the day, that area had a slight kind of ammonia type odor. And sometimes when you're aerating your compost pile, sometimes you hit a pocket that wasn't properly aerated, or maybe it was too dense and wet and air didn't get in there and it's really stinky. If you throw in biochar at the beginning, it makes it a lot more forgiving, and so it reduces the odor, and it also increases the temperature of the composting. A smaller, more modest compost pile won't usually get to really, really high temperatures, but if you add biochar, you're able to get it to really high temperatures. At Giltrap Farm, the observed temperature difference was without biochar, the piles, which they're not giant windrows, they're a modest pile, but they would heat up to maybe 130-ish degrees. But when biochar was added, the same size pile would heat up to 150, that's 155 Fahrenheit, that's something like 68 degrees centigrade. So adding the biochar causes the compost to compost a lot hotter. And the reason that happens is it facilitates the transfer of electrons between the microbes. In a nutshell, basically the microbes use electrons almost like a currency. Some of them carry out processes that run a deficit, and some of them produce an excess, and they have to trade these electrons. And the biochar is conductive. It's almost like graphite. And when you facilitate the transfer of electrons, it speeds up the microbial economy. And so the whole thing heats up and you get a higher quality decomposition, right? Those are the benefits from sticking it in before.
Thanks, Austin. Listen, so, we're incredibly lucky to have Rob with us today. And we, the questions all seem to be very biochar focused. So Rob, you've been listening into this, this conversation so far. Is there any, let's put something out there for people who are looking to just start, like urban agriculture? Or first of all, is there anything specific that you would like to say? And if not, my question is, or in addition to my question is, what would be a word of advice for people who, are looking to starting a veggie garden in an urban area, and do they go buy soil? Do they get it from the municipal compost? I mean, what would you advise?
Thank you so much. Good morning again. So a couple things. First of all, in determining a site and doing site selection, get your soil tested first and foremost, right? At the very least, you want basic nutrients, macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, but also you want to at least test for lead, certainly soil pH, and many of the soil labs will also test for cation exchange capacity as well. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is in many more urbanized settings, soil is less homogeneous and much more heterogeneous, meaning that it's much more variable, even from 1 square foot to the next at times, depending on where you are. And so things to think about are also best practices, right? Even if one gets their soil tested and has low levels of trace contaminants of heavy metals, for example, that are below threshold levels, you still want to operate in such a way that you're growing safely, right? So I have some resources called Safe Soils I can post on the chat in a minute, but those would be the first sets of things. The other that I'm interested in on a couple of levels is really looking at the scalability of biochar applications, and also looking at these practices in terms of ways to ultimately improve soil quality in the context of sites that have low levels of contaminants and rates of dilution in particular as well. There is some research out there that indicates that compost high in phosphates may help mitigate some of the issues of lead, but there's a balance between lead and arsenic also to think about. So there's a lot more research to do. I'm still really getting to know this group. I'm still also learning about biochar. I consider myself more novice. I couldn't say in any way expert, especially on biochar. So I hope to work with this group over time, and let's go after some grant funding and other funding possibilities to the degree it's possible. My roles are changing, so I'll be more able to realistically take on those efforts and work with all of you on that more in the fall, winter. Thanks.
Wow. Okay. So that's amazing. Quick question: Where would you suggest people can go and get, a soil test? Like.
So if you go to the UC Cooperative Extension Master Gardener Program websites, the one county in California that does not have a UC Cooperative Extension office, ironically, is San Francisco. So in that case, you would go to San Mateo County. But in just about every county Cooperative Extension Master Gardener Program's website, you just Google UCCE, meaning UC Cooperative Extension, and then the county name, and then Master Gardener Program. Almost all of them, if not all of them, actually have a regularly upkept lab list of soil testing and vegetative. Some of them do also vegetative tissue analysis as well. And so that would be where you would go to look for labs. That usually is upkept about every 2 to 3 years for the most part in most counties.
Okay, so if you have a chance, please post a link, just maybe, for the Berkeley one, or, regarding the scalability, we started 10 minutes before because Becky came on and we already started. So the thing about the scalability is it's kind of a chicken or egg situation, because biochar doesn't have a market. So people don't produce equipment to make biochar. But because of that, we don't have biochar, and then people can't test it. So it's very difficult. What we are hoping to do is, there's All Power Labs, and it's a pretty good, let me say, gasification company, and then there are others. And then, but All Power Labs and the local carbon network, the local carbon network is a project of All Power Labs, because even though it really works very independently and only really focuses on the biochar and the communities and the teaching, the composting and everything. And, the big idea there is to get people to know and understand and use the biochar, and then get the waste streams in the communities. And so, just not let that get trucked off to landfill. There's nutshells and there's all sorts of, wastewood streams that invasive species and the beetle bugs and whatnot. And so, trying to find these streams of wastewood. And when we have all that in place, possibly get some equipment, because, for example, All Power Labs equipment is really small. It's a 20 kilowatt machine. So, for example, in a community garden setting, or a school or a church, or a school with a garden, then you could be heating the school, giving electricity to the school. Probably some investor is interested in doing that, and then we have all the biochar and be able to. So the scalability, is it scalable? Yes, it is from a technical point of view, and now we just have to kind of do the people work, and build these communities, and yeah, so take it from there. We are actually 4 minutes off overtime already. So does anyone want to add a final comment? Just raise your hands. Elizabeth and Bob. Okay, Bob, you go first.
Just something I read today. I've never heard of a lazy composter. They've got their shit together.
Love it. Elizabeth?
It's very cute. I just wanted to say Austin has some great pictures of plants that are with and without the compost that's created with the APL biochar, and I will post those to the Facebook group.
Yeah, are you okay posting them to the group and not sharing them right away? I mean, what do you prefer?
I think they've already been shared to the group.
I'm sorry, through the Facebook group.
Okay, let's do that. Let's just send a little, we'll comment it, so we'll remind people, we'll look at them again. Okay, and
haven't those pictures already been shared to the group? I think the photos mostly from your platform.
Just comment them so that they come to the surface to the top and we can look at them again.
Okay.
And then, so Rob, there's a message from Elizabeth to Rob, so everyone just go and look at your messages. Yes, the answer is yes. Okay, well, listen, I had a lot of fun. I hope you guys had found this interesting and fun as well. And we are going to be meeting again next week, 9 a.m. PST and 6 p.m. European time, European Central Time. And yeah, great. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, I don't know. Bye. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia.
Bye-bye.